My dear friends, have you ever thought that a lakeside industrial city, with winds sweeping through its streets and autumn leaves painting everything in gold, could still hide secrets powerful enough to leave everyone stunned? Cleveland, long known for its soulful jazz along Euclid Avenue, for its resilient people and quiet beauty by Lake Erie. But then, on an autumn morning in 2012, a shocking event unfolded. Inside the imposing brick building of the Cleveland Police Department, during what was supposed to be just another routine quarterly meeting, an unprecedented moment took place. A black female detective suddenly rose to her feet, removed her badge, pulled out a pair of handcuffs, and arrested her own captain, before the stunned eyes of colleagues and reporters alike. Before we dive deeper together into this mysterious journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on Justice Voice and turn on the notification bell. That way, every thrilling and surprising story will always reach you first. The autumn air in Cleveland carried a sharp chill that year, the kind that hinted winter was not far behind. Leaves scattered along Euclid Avenue in shades of burnt orange and faded gold, crunching under the boots of officers hurrying into the imposing brick building of the Cleveland Police Department. Inside those walls, the day was supposed to unfold with routine formality. Another quarterly meeting, another string of statistics, another polished speech from the captain about the department's accomplishments. No one expected history to be written within those walls. Detective Angela Carter sat quietly near the middle of the room, her posture straight, her face unreadable. At 42, she had seen enough of life to know that appearances often told only half the truth. The room was filled with colleagues, senior officials, and even a handful of reporters scribbling in notepads, waiting for the usual parade of numbers and praise. Angela's hands were folded neatly in her lap, but inside, her heart was beating in a steady drum. She knew what she was about to do would alter everything not only for her career, but for her city. For months, she had carried the weight of secrets. She had walked through alleys and sat in dim-lit diners gathering testimonies. She had photographed hidden ledgers, copied financial records, and listened to whispers that no one dared to speak aloud in public. The deeper she dug, the clearer the picture became. Corruption had seeped into the very veins of the department. And at the center of it all stood Captain Richard Doyle, the man who was about to stride confidently to the podium. Angela glanced across the room and caught sight of Officer Mark Henderson, the young man she had quietly taken under her wing. Mark's eyes met hers briefly, and though he said nothing, the flicker of nervous understanding passed between them. He knew pieces of what she had uncovered. He had even slipped her a document or two, never asking questions, only trusting her judgment. Mark was new, still hopeful that the badge meant honor. Angela intended to make sure he wouldn't lose that hope. The chatter in the room quieted as Doyle walked in. He carried himself with the ease of a man who believed he was untouchable. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver strands combed neatly through his dark hair, Doyle had long cultivated the image of a respectable leader. He shook hands, exchanged smiles, and settled at the front, tapping the microphone with an air of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the room, smooth and confident. "It has been a remarkable quarter for our department. Crime is down in 3 districts. Our officers have shown extraordinary commitment, and let us not forget the recognition we've received from City Hall for our tireless service." The words spilled effortlessly, each one polished, rehearsed, designed to pacify the crowd. Reporters scribbled, colleagues nodded. But Angela sat still, her eyes locked on him, her jaw tight. She had heard enough of Doyle's speeches to know the hollow ring they carried. He was not celebrating the achievements of justice. He was protecting his empire. A bead of sweat traced down Angela's spine, though her face remained calm. She reached down into the side pocket of her blazer and touched the cold steel of the handcuffs she had carried for weeks. They were a constant reminder of the choice she had made, to stop being silent, to stop waiting for someone else to act. From the corner, Sarah Whitman, a young journalist for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, adjusted her glasses and flipped a fresh page in her notebook. She had been assigned this meeting almost as an afterthought, another dry departmental update for tomorrow's paper. But as she glanced at Detective Carter, something about the woman's steady, unblinking gaze caught her attention. Sarah scribbled a note to herself without quite knowing why. "Watch her." Doyle's speech rolled on, his tone swelling with pride as he listed accomplishments, promotions, commendations. The room felt lulled into complacency. And then, quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, Angela stood. The scrape of her chair against the floor echoed louder than expected. Heads turned, a few brows furrowed. Doyle paused, surprised by the interruption but not yet alarmed. Angela's voice was clear, unwavering, and it sliced through the room like a blade. "Captain Doyle," she said, her eyes fixed on him, "you have betrayed your oath to uphold justice." A stunned silence fell. The reporters froze, their pens hovering over paper. Officers shifted in their seats, unsure if they had heard correctly. Doyle's expression flickered, just for a moment, before he forced a smile. "Detective Carter," he said smoothly, "perhaps you'd like to save your comments for—" But he never finished. Angela stepped forward, pulling the steel cuffs from her pocket. In one fluid motion, she snapped them around his wrists. The metallic click rang out, final and undeniable. Gasps rippled across the room. A hush so complete followed that the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. The captain of the Cleveland Police Department had just been handcuffed by his own detective, in front of his entire staff and the press. And in that frozen moment, as Doyle's face hardened with shock and rage, Angela looked out across the room and said the words that would reverberate far beyond those walls. "Justice has no place for compromise." The metallic click of the cuffs still echoed in the room when the first murmurs began. It was not the kind of sound anyone expected to hear in a police conference, least of all with the captain as the one restrained. The initial silence shattered into a dozen voices, rising in disbelief, protest, and confusion. "Detective Carter, what in God's name are you doing?" one senior officer barked, half rising from his chair. "This is outrageous," another shouted. A few reporters stumbled to their feet, fumbling with their recorders and cameras, suddenly realizing they were witnessing not just a story, but the story, one that would rock the city. Angela stood firm, her hands still on the chain of the cuffs as Doyle glared at her, his face flushed red with fury. His voice was low at first, but it carried menace. "Take these off me," he hissed. "You've lost your mind, Carter. You'll regret this before the day is over." But Angela didn't flinch. "The evidence speaks for itself, Captain," she replied evenly. "You have taken bribes, shielded criminals, and betrayed the oath we all swore. You don't belong at that podium. You belong in custody." The room gasped again. Some officers exchanged uneasy glances. Others looked down at their shoes, unwilling to meet her eyes. It was the reaction Angela had expected: fear and hesitation. She knew many of them suspected Doyle's corruption, but had chosen silence. And now that silence hung over them like a weight, every second more damning than the last. From the back of the room, Officer Mark Henderson stood frozen, his young face pale, his breath shallow. He had known something was coming. Angela's conviction had been unshakable in recent weeks, but he hadn't imagined it would unfold here, in this explosive way. Yet seeing her standing tall, unafraid, he felt a spark ignite in his chest. Maybe this was the kind of courage he had always dreamed the badge represented. Near him, Sarah Whitman's hands trembled slightly as she steadied her recorder. Her journalist instincts screamed that she was standing at the center of a storm. She had covered political scandals before, even corruption trials, but never had she seen justice enforced so dramatically in real time. The words, "Justice has no place for compromise," rang in her ears like a headline already written. Doyle tried to steady himself, his voice louder now. "This is a stunt. She's grandstanding. Someone remove these cuffs immediately." But no one moved. The hierarchy of the department had fractured in an instant. No one dared to touch him, and no one dared to oppose Angela outright. The balance of power had shifted, even if only for a moment. Angela pulled a manila folder from her bag and slapped it down on the table in front of the stunned officials. The papers spilled slightly, revealing photographs, signed statements, and financial records. "This," she declared, "is what you've been hiding. Payments from known gang leaders, property deeds in your brother-in-law's name, case files you had sealed to protect your friends. This is not rumor, this is not speculation. This is proof." Her words cut through the uproar like a knife. Reporters surged forward trying to glimpse the documents. Officers shifted uncomfortably. Doyle, however, laughed a hollow, bitter sound. "You think a few scraps of paper will hold up against me? You're finished, Carter. I have friends on the council, in City Hall, in the State House. You think anyone is going to back you over me?" Angela met his gaze calmly. "If the truth is strong enough, it doesn't need friends in high places." For the first time, a ripple of approval stirred among the crowd. A few younger officers looked at her with something like awe, though none dared speak aloud. Mark's fists clenched at his sides. He remembered the long nights in the archives, helping Angela dig through boxes of dusty records. He remembered the whispered warnings from colleagues. Stop asking questions, kid, or you'll end your career before it starts. Yet here was Angela, risking everything openly. And suddenly, he felt a surge of determination. He would stand with her, come what may. The tension in the room thickened. Sarah raised her hand, her voice trembling but clear. "Detective Carter, do you intend to press formal charges here and now?" Angela turned toward her, nodding slightly. "Yes. This department cannot be led by a man who betrays the very law he's sworn to protect. Today marks the beginning of accountability." The words were like sparks on dry timber. Reporters began shouting questions, snapping photos, recording every syllable. The scene had transformed into chaos. Doyle struggled against the cuffs, his fury barely contained. "You'll pay for this," he spat. "Every ally you think you have will abandon you, and when the dust settles, you'll be nothing." Angela leaned close enough for only him to hear, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Maybe, but I'd rather be nothing with honor than everything built on lies." For a long moment, their eyes locked, the old lion unwilling to yield, the determined detective refusing to bend. Then the doors burst open. A pair of internal affairs officers, summoned quietly earlier by Angela, entered the room. Their presence confirmed what many had begun to realize. This was no impulsive rebellion. This was a carefully planned strike. "Captain Richard Doyle," one of them announced formally, "you are under investigation for corruption, obstruction of justice, and misconduct in office. You'll come with us." The sound of Doyle being led away in cuffs sent another ripple through the room. Some officers avoided watching, ashamed. Others exhaled deeply, as if they had been holding their breath for years. And the reporters, Sarah among them, scrambled to capture every detail. As the doors closed behind Doyle, the room seemed strangely quiet, drained of its earlier uproar. Angela stood at the center, her hands steady now, but inside she felt the weight of what had just begun. Arresting Doyle was not the end, it was only the opening move. She knew the forces protecting him would not go down quietly. Mark approached slowly, his voice low. "Detective Carter, that was necessary," she finished for him, turning to meet his earnest gaze. "This department belongs to the people, Mark, not to men like him. Don't ever forget that." Sarah stepped closer too, still clutching her recorder. "Detective, may I speak with you later? Off the record, perhaps?" Angela studied her for a moment. She saw in Sarah's eyes not just curiosity, but resolve. Maybe the press could be an ally after all. She gave a small nod. Later, as the meeting dissolved into murmurs and hurried exits, Angela remained standing, alone in the middle of the room. She had lit the match. Now she would have to face the fire it unleashed. That night, headlines blazed across Cleveland. "Police captain arrested by own detective in shocking turn." The story spread beyond the city by morning, picked up by national outlets. Some hailed Angela as a hero, a defender of justice. Others condemned her as reckless, a destabilizing force in an already fragile department. But Angela knew one thing with certainty. There was no turning back. The fight for truth had only just begun, and she was standing on the front line. The morning after the arrest, the city of Cleveland woke to a storm not of rain or thunder, but of headlines, debates, and whispered conversations in every diner, office, and living room. Across front pages, bold black letters declared, "Detective handcuffs her own captain." Photographs of Angela Carter standing with iron determination, her hand clutching the cuffs on Captain Richard Doyle, were splashed everywhere. Some papers hailed her as a fearless whistleblower. Others questioned whether she had crossed a dangerous line, undermining the chain of command. Angela, meanwhile, sat at her modest kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee, her eyes scanning the newspaper. She wasn't reading the words as much as she was bracing herself for the war that was unfolding. Her phone buzzed constantly, messages from colleagues, anonymous threats, requests from reporters. She ignored most of them. The weight of what she had set in motion was heavy, but it was also irreversible. By mid-morning, she was summoned downtown to Internal Affairs headquarters. The sterile gray building loomed against the autumn sky, its flag whipping in the cold wind. Angela tightened her coat and stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor. She was ushered into a conference room where 3 investigators waited, stern-faced men and women with stacks of files already before them. At the end of the table sat Lieutenant Harris, head of Internal Affairs, a man known for his meticulous nature and an unyielding stare. "Detective Carter," Harris began, his tone even, "you've certainly set the city ablaze. Before we proceed further, we need every detail of what led you to act yesterday. The evidence, your methods, your motives, everything." Angela slid the thick folder she had prepared across the table. "You'll find signed testimonies, bank records, and surveillance notes," she said steadily. "All corroborated. Doyle has been funneling protection money through shell companies tied to his relatives. He's interfered in multiple investigations to shield those paying him. This isn't rumor, it's documented." Harris flipped through the papers, his eyes narrowing. "And you chose to confront him in a public meeting rather than bring this directly to us beforehand. Why?" Angela's jaw tightened. "Because bringing it quietly could have meant burying it. Too many hands in this department are already stained. The only way the truth would breathe was if the world saw it in daylight. There could be no backroom deals, no chance to sweep it away." The room fell into uneasy silence. One of the investigators shifted uncomfortably. Harris studied her for a long moment, then leaned back. "You forced our hand, Detective. The investigation will expand. But you should be aware you've made powerful enemies. This won't be easy for you." Angela nodded. She had expected nothing less. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah Whitman typed furiously at her desk in the newsroom. The clatter of keys filled the air as she shaped the story not just as a spectacle, but as a question of conscience. Her editor hovered nearby, muttering about deadlines and sensational headlines. But Sarah ignored him. She was determined to frame Angela not as reckless, but as courageous someone who had put her career and safety on the line to uphold justice. Still, she knew the backlash was coming. Politicians who had enjoyed Doyle's favors would scramble to discredit Angela. The department itself would fracture between those who admired her and those who feared the chaos she represented. Sarah could feel the tremor of a larger battle beneath the surface. At the precinct, that fracture was already visible. Some officers muttered that Angela had betrayed the family. Others, especially younger recruits, whispered with admiration, emboldened by her defiance. Mark Henderson, caught between those two currents, felt the pressure most of all. In the locker room, a senior sergeant cornered him. "You've been close with Carter, haven't you?" the sergeant said, his voice low and threatening. "Word of advice, kid. Distance yourself. She's radioactive now. Stick with her, and your career's over before it begins." Mark swallowed hard but met the man's stare. "With respect, sir, if standing with what's right ends my career, then maybe it's a career not worth having." The sergeant's eyes narrowed before he walked away, muttering under his breath. Mark exhaled slowly, his hands shaking. It was easier to say the words than to carry the weight of them, but deep down, he knew he had chosen his side. That evening, Angela walked the quiet streets of her neighborhood. The crisp autumn air carried the smell of wood smoke from chimneys. Children laughed as they played near piles of leaves. For a moment, the normalcy was almost surreal against the storm swirling around her. But as she turned a corner, her senses sharpened. A black sedan idled at the end of the block. Its headlights flicked on the moment she stepped into view. Slowly, it rolled past her, its tinted windows concealing the occupants. Angela's hand instinctively brushed the holster at her side, though she knew it wouldn't come to that not yet. Still, the message was clear. She was being watched. She didn't flinch. She simply walked on, her steps steady, though inside she felt the cold reminder that Doyle's allies would not sit idle. The battle had already moved beyond courtrooms and headlines. It was seeping into her daily life. When she reached her front door, she paused, glancing back once more at the street now empty and quiet. She whispered to herself, as if reminding her own heart, justice has no place for compromise. In the following days, the investigation widened. Internal Affairs raided offices, seized files, questioned officers. The ripple spread through City Hall, ensnaring council members and local businessmen tied to Doyle's network. The city buzzed with rumors, each more damning than the last. But for Angela, the spotlight was suffocating. Every step she took was watched, every word dissected. She was called a hero by some, a traitor by others. Anonymous letters arrived at her doorstep, some thanking her, others warning her to back off or pay the price. Mark checked in often, his youthful loyalty a small comfort. "You're not alone in this," he told her one night, as they sat in the precinct's dim break room. "People are afraid, but they're also waking up. You've given them something they didn't think was possible, a reason to believe again." Angela gave him a faint smile. "Belief is dangerous, Mark. It stirs hope, and hope terrifies those who thrive on fear." At the newsroom, Sarah's articles gained traction. She painted Angela not as a rogue, but as a symbol of integrity. Readers flooded the paper with letters, some praising, some outraged. Sarah herself received threats, but she pressed on. She felt drawn to Angela's cause, compelled not just as a journalist, but as a citizen who longed for honesty in a city that had lost faith. Late one evening, Sarah met Angela at a quiet diner. Over coffee, Sarah leaned in. "They'll try to destroy you. They'll dig into your past, twist your words, smear your name. Are you ready for that?" Angela stirred her coffee slowly. "I'm not sure anyone is ever ready. But I know this. If I stop now, then every risk, every sleepless night, every ounce of courage, it will all have been for nothing." Sarah nodded, her recorder tucked away. This was not for the paper. This was one woman speaking to another, both aware of the cost of truth. By the end of that week, Cleveland was a city divided. On one side were those who demanded a thorough cleansing of corruption, inspired by Angela's boldness. On the other were those who feared instability, insisting she had acted recklessly. The mayor called for calm, but whispers of deeper conspiracies swirled. And through it all, Angela stood in the center, resolute yet weary, knowing that the real battle had only begun. One evening, as she locked up her office, Mark hurried in, breathless. "Detective, you need to see this." He handed her a plain envelope that had been slipped under the precinct's door. Inside was a single photograph. Angela, walking alone down her street. Scrawled in black ink across the bottom were 4 words. "You're next, Carter." Angela stared at it, her jaw set. She slid the photo back into the envelope and tucked it under her arm. Fear prickled at the edges of her resolve, but she refused to let it show. She looked at Mark, her voice calm. "Then let them come." The city of Cleveland seemed to breathe differently in the days after Doyle's arrest, as though the very air carried a charge of unease and expectation. Everywhere Angela Carter went, whispers followed, not loud enough to be open accusations, but sharp enough to cut. At the precinct, conversations fell silent when she entered, and officers who had once shared coffee with her now avoided her eyes. Some muttered words like traitor under their breath, others simply walked away. The chain of command had always been sacred, and by snapping handcuffs on her captain in front of the world, Angela had broken it in the most public way imaginable. Yet beneath that coldness she sensed something else. A quiet current of admiration from younger officers who were too afraid to speak aloud, but whose glances betrayed respect. Mark Henderson remained by her side through it all, bringing files, sitting with her in silence, making sure she never faced the long hallways alone. One afternoon he whispered, almost apologetically, that the others were scared. They were not only afraid of Doyle's allies, but also of change itself, of the chaos that tearing down corruption might unleash. Angela had nodded slowly, telling him that fear never excused silence. The press, which had first hailed her as courageous, began to shift in tone. Headlines questioned her motives. Articles appeared with anonymous sources, claiming she was ambitious, reckless, even unstable. One rival paper suggested her bold arrest was a calculated move to gain power within the department. Sarah Whitman, who had defended her from the start, saw clearly what was happening. Doyle's friends still held influence, and they were orchestrating a smear campaign to destroy Angela's credibility. Sarah called her late one night, warning that her enemies would dig into her past, twist her words, and smear her name. Angela, her voice steady, though fatigue seeped through, simply answered that lies could be loud, but the truth endured. She tried to believe that. The threats moved beyond words soon after. One rainy evening, as Angela left the precinct, she sensed footsteps behind her. A man emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by a hood, his voice low and mocking as he told her she had stirred a hornet's nest. He offered her a choice: walk away with a comfortable future, or continue down a path that would end badly for her. Angela had not flinched. She told him that not everyone had a price. His chuckle before disappearing into the darkness echoed long after he was gone, and Angela stood there breathing steadily even as her heart hammered. She knew then that intimidation had begun, and if that failed, worse would follow. The next day, an older woman knocked on her door. Angela recognized her instantly, Mrs. Alvarez, the mother of a young man murdered 2 years earlier in a case Doyle had suspiciously closed. Tears filled her eyes as she clutched Angela's hand, whispering that she had seen the news and begging her not to stop. Angela promised quietly that she would not. After the woman left, Angela sat alone, staring at the walls of her modest living room, surrounded by case files and shadows. For all the isolation and danger, moments like that reminded her why she had chosen this fight. It was never about ambition. It was about mothers like Mrs. Alvarez, about young officers like Mark, about a city suffocating under corruption. Meanwhile, Sarah fought her own battles in the newsroom. Her editor pressed her to balance the story, to avoid painting Angela as too noble, insisting they were not in the business of making saints. But Sarah resisted. She dug deeper, uncovering financial records, interviewing witnesses, connecting threads that showed Doyle's corruption was only a piece of something larger. One evening, she confided to Angela that someone had broken into her apartment, ransacked her files, and left a knife lodged in her kitchen table. Her voice trembled as she admitted they wanted her silent. Angela placed a firm hand on her shoulder, telling her that fear meant they were getting closer to the truth. By the end of that week, Cleveland was a city divided. Flyers appeared calling Angela a traitor. Talk radio hosts debated whether she had destroyed the department's stability. But churches prayed for her, neighborhood groups wrote letters of support, and ordinary citizens whispered hope. Angela knew the storm was building. It was no longer about one corrupt captain, but about an entire system fighting to preserve itself. One evening, as she closed the blinds in her living room, her phone rang. Mark's voice was urgent, telling her there had been a break-in at the records office, and files connected to Doyle had vanished. Angela felt the weight of it, but answered with quiet steel that they would move faster, that if her enemies wanted to erase the truth, she would make sure it was too late to hide. She hung up, staring at the envelope of evidence on her table, knowing that the fight was far from over. It had only deepened, and every step forward dragged her further into the shadows of men who would rather destroy her than let the truth reach the light. But Angela Carter, weary yet unbending, whispered to herself as she had so many times before, justice had no place for compromise. The days rolled on with a heaviness that Angela Carter could feel in her bones, yet somewhere within that weight a fire kept burning, small but steady. The threats had grown louder, the isolation more profound, but so too had the whispers of support. It was in the letters slipped anonymously under her office door, scrawled in uneven handwriting, "Keep going, we believe in you." It was in the nods from strangers on the street, quick and cautious but meaningful. And it was in the steady presence of Mark Henderson, who despite his youth and the warnings from older officers, refused to abandon her. Together they sifted through what remained of the records after the break-in, piecing together a picture that grew uglier with each file they touched. The corruption was not confined to Doyle. It stretched outward like roots beneath the soil, touching city council members, contractors, and even judges whose rulings had bent suspiciously in favor of Doyle's allies. Angela knew the scope of it was far greater than she had first imagined, and the danger correspondingly greater. One evening, as she spread papers across her kitchen table, Sarah Whitman arrived, weary from long hours at the newsroom but carrying a folder of her own. She had traced financial ties between a prominent real estate developer and a shell company that funneled money into Doyle's accounts. "This isn't just about the department," Sarah said, lowering her voice though they were alone. "It's about the city itself. Contracts, zoning deals, development projects all rigged. He was a piece on the board, but the game is bigger than him." Angela rubbed her temples, the enormity of it pressing down. "If we expose all of it, we're not just taking down a captain. We're taking on a whole network of power." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. "And that's why you can't do it alone." In that moment, Angela realized that her fight was no longer solitary. She had allies few, but determined. Mark, Sarah, and even citizens she didn't yet know were standing with her in their own ways. The system was vast, but so was the hunger for truth. The very next day, she felt the first stirrings of that collective will when she attended a community meeting in a modest church basement on the city's west side. She had been hesitant to go, wary of turning the investigation into a spectacle, but the invitation had been persistent. When she arrived, the room was packed with ordinary Clevelanders' factory workers, teachers, mothers, retirees' faces, lined not with anger, but with quiet determination. When she walked in, the crowd fell silent, then slowly erupted into applause. Angela was taken aback, unused to being treated as anything other than controversial, even despised in recent weeks. A woman stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "We've been waiting for someone to stand up. They've stolen from us for years, stolen our safety, our trust. But you showed us it can be done." Angela felt her throat tighten. She wasn't one for speeches, but she spoke simply, her voice carrying over the room. "I can't promise this will be easy. What we're up against is bigger than me, bigger than this department. But if truth matters to you, if justice matters, then stand with me, not for me, but for the city we all love." The crowd's response was overwhelming. In their eyes, she saw not just admiration, but resolve. She realized that the fight was no longer hers alone. It had become something larger, a movement that could not easily be silenced. Yet with every step forward came sharper retaliation. That same week, Angela discovered that her bank account had been flagged for irregularities, a manufactured pretense that froze her funds. Her car was vandalized, windows shattered, tires slashed. Anonymous callers filled her nights with threats of violence. But instead of breaking her, each act only reinforced her belief that she was hitting the heart of something deeply corrupt. "They're afraid," she told Mark one evening, as they stood outside the precinct, the city lights flickering against the dark sky. "And fear makes men desperate." Mark looked at her, his youthful face carrying a seriousness that seemed far older than his years. "So what do we do?" Angela glanced at him, her jaw set. "We keep going, we dive deeper, and when we have enough, we drop it all where no one can bury it." Sarah, too, intensified her work. She began publishing a series of investigative pieces, each one revealing another layer of the network. She was careful, meticulously sourcing her claims, but the impact was seismic. Public anger grew louder, the calls for reform impossible to ignore. With each article, Angela felt the circle tightening not only around the truth, but around her own safety. One night, Sarah arrived at Angela's house visibly shaken. Someone had broken into her apartment, ransacked her files, left a knife embedded in her kitchen table. "They want me silent," she whispered, her hands trembling. Angela placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Then they're scared of what you're uncovering. That means we're closer than ever." For a moment, the two women sat in silence, bound by the knowledge that their fight was as personal as it was political. Each risked not just careers, but lives. Yet neither considered walking away. By the end of that week, Angela's suspicions were confirmed when an informant approached her discreetly. A former low-level player in Doyle's circle, the man was jittery, his eyes darting around as if expecting to be watched. "It goes higher than you think," he muttered. Doyle was just the shield. There are councilmen, judges, businessmen, names you wouldn't believe. They meet in private, decide who gets what contract, who gets protection, who gets destroyed. Doyle was valuable because he kept the streets quiet, but he wasn't the top. Angela pressed him gently. "Then who is?" The man hesitated, his fear palpable. Finally, he whispered a name that made Angela's blood run cold. It was a respected public figure, someone seen as untouchable, a man celebrated for his philanthropy and political connections. The realization struck her like a blow. She wasn't just challenging corruption in the department, she was challenging the very power structure of Cleveland. That night, Angela sat alone at her table, the city's noise muffled outside her window. She stared at the evidence she had gathered, the names and numbers that told a story of betrayal and greed. She thought of Mrs. Alvarez, of Mark's quiet loyalty, of Sarah's trembling resolve. She thought of the children playing on cracked sidewalks, of families who deserved better than a city ruled by shadows. And she whispered to herself once more, a mantra she clung to when fear crept in. Justice has no place for compromise. The battle ahead would be brutal, perhaps even unwinnable. But Angela knew she had crossed the line of no return. The question was no longer whether she could survive it, but whether she could carry the truth far enough into the light before the darkness closed in. Angela Carter had learned that standing still was no longer an option. Since the day she snapped handcuffs on Captain Doyle, her life had been turned upside down with threats, whispers, and endless scrutiny. At first she endured, holding her ground against the storm, but as the days stretched on, she realized that reacting wasn't enough. If she let her enemies dictate every move, they would crush her. She had to strike back. Quietly, she began reaching out beyond the walls of the precinct. Retired detectives who had left in disgust, community leaders who had long suspected the city's dealings were dirty, even clergy who heard the confessions of weary citizens, all became part of a small but loyal circle. Sarah Whitman, her unlikely ally in the press, and young officer Mark Henderson stood closest at her side. Together, they pieced through files and traced the lines of corruption that stretched far beyond Doyle. One night, Sarah uncovered a thread that changed everything. Financial transfers linking a celebrated city councilman and a powerful real estate developer to the same shell companies Doyle had used. The sums were staggering, millions funneled under false names. Angela read the evidence in silence, the weight of it pressing down on her. This was no longer about one captain. This was about men who sat at the top of Cleveland's power structure, men untouchable in the eyes of the public. Angela saw it in the community too. When she spoke in a church basement to a crowd of teachers, factory workers, and mothers, they listened with a hunger she had never seen before. They told her about unfair contracts, missing cases, and decades of silence. For the first time, she felt the city leaning toward her, a tide of ordinary voices tired of living under shadows. But she also knew the louder that tide became, the more desperate the opposition would grow. She found proof of that waiting in her driveway one night. A man in a suit, smooth-talking and polite, offered her an envelope thick with cash. His words were quiet but sharp. Walk away and live comfortably, or stay and risk losing everything. Angela pushed the envelope back without hesitation. You've mistaken me for someone who can be bought. His smile never faltered. But his warning was blunt. Children had lost their mothers for far less. When he left, she stood in the cold night air, fists clenched, knowing she had crossed into even darker territory. The threats did not stop her. Instead, she pushed harder. Mark combed through old archives, uncovering cases that showed Doyle's fingerprints again and again. Sarah published articles that stripped away the image of Cleveland's leaders piece by piece. With each story, public anger grew louder, and with each story, the retaliation sharpened. Sarah's car was vandalized. Mark found himself followed by unmarked vehicles, and Angela's nights filled with anonymous calls. Yet none of them backed down. One day, a plain envelope appeared at Angela's office. Inside was a list of names, councilmen, judges, businessmen with amounts of money written beside each. At the bottom, a note from someone who believes, don't stop. Angela held the paper for a long time, realizing that cracks were forming inside the very system she was fighting. Someone on the inside wanted her to win. That gave her hope, and hope gave her strength. By month's end, Cleveland was no longer whispering about corruption, it was roaring. Protests shook City Hall. The police department split in half, and national media flooded the streets. Angela walked through it all with quiet resolve, her face steady though she felt danger closer every day. One night she found another envelope under her office door, this time containing only a photograph of herself, standing on her own porch. Across the bottom in black ink were two words, last warning. Angela folded the picture neatly and tucked it into her growing stack of threats. She refused to show fear. Instead, she whispered the words that had carried her this far, the same words that now felt carved into her very soul. Justice has no place for compromise. And with that, she knew the time for defense was over. The next move would be hers, and when it came, it would shake the city to its core. Angela Carter had reached the point where hesitation was no longer possible. For weeks, she had endured whispers, threats, and the suffocating weight of isolation. But now she held something her enemies could not silence. Proof. The envelope that had arrived with its list of names and figures was not just another warning, it was a key. If used wisely, it could break open the wall that had protected Cleveland's most powerful men for decades. Late one night, she sat at her kitchen table with Mark and Sarah, the papers spread out between them. Mark leaned over, his youthful face hardened by determination. If this is real, it ties half the city together, he said. Sarah, tapping her pen against her notepad, added quietly, it's real. I cross-checked 3 of these names with property records and campaign donations. The numbers match. Whoever sent this wanted you to have the truth. Angela's eyes lingered on the list. Councilmen, judges, businessmen, names praised at banquets and ribbon cuttings, names written in glowing headlines. To accuse them without caution would mean suicide. But to hold back meant giving the network time to strike first. She finally looked at her companions. We can't keep this hidden, but if we release it all at once, they'll bury it in chaos. We need to drop it piece by piece, build the pressure until they can't escape. The plan began the next morning. Sarah published a new article, carefully sourced, revealing a councilman's suspicious ties to Doyle's shell companies. Within hours, the city buzzed with outrage. The councilman denied everything, called it a smear campaign, but documents spoke louder than words. The following week came another story, this time a judge whose rulings had favored businesses funneling money through the same network. Bit by bit, the fortress cracked. Angela knew she was painting a target on herself, larger than ever before. But for the first time, she felt momentum swinging in her favor. At community meetings, people stood to thank her, their voices trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. We've lived under this shadow for too long, one man told her, gripping her hand tightly. Don't stop now. She promised she wouldn't, but the enemy struck back. Late one night, as she drove home, A dark SUV appeared in her rearview mirror. Its headlights stayed close, far too close for miles. At the last turn before her street, the vehicle swerved, forcing her toward the curb. Tires screeched, metal scraped, but Angela fought the wheel and steadied the car. By the time she pulled over, the SUV was gone. She sat in the silence, her hands gripping the wheel, her breath ragged. They had tried to scare her, or worse. The next morning, Mark stormed into her office, his fists clenched. "This isn't just intimidation anymore," he said. "They want you gone, permanently." Angela met his anger with calm resolve. "Then they're desperate," she replied. "And desperation means they're losing." Sarah's articles continued, each more damning than the last, and Angela fed her evidence carefully, ensuring nothing could be dismissed as speculation. Soon, national outlets picked up the story, and Cleveland found itself in the spotlight. The mayor called for an emergency inquiry, and federal investigators began asking questions that could no longer be ignored. The fortress was not falling yet, but its foundations were trembling. One evening, Angela received another message slipped under her office door. It contained no threats, no photographs, only a single sentence written in neat handwriting. "Look deeper at the development contracts on the riverfront." She showed it to Sarah, who dug into city records and uncovered what might be the most explosive revelation yet. Millions of dollars funneled into a project that never existed, money siphoned directly into private accounts of the very men who claimed to champion the city's renewal. Angela stared at the evidence with a mix of dread and satisfaction. This was it, the kind of revelation that could ignite a fire too big to smother. She felt the storm gathering, stronger than ever, but for the first time she also felt the path ahead clearing. The time for shadows was ending. That night, as rain lashed against her windows, Angela sat alone with the files spread before her. She thought of Doyle, of the councilmen, of the men in suits who believed themselves untouchable. She thought of the mothers who had lost children, the neighborhoods left to rot, the officers who had chosen silence. And she whispered the words that had carried her through every dark hour. Justice has no place for compromise. The next move would not be theirs. It would be hers, and it would shake the city to its core. The storm Angela Carter had long anticipated finally broke in full force. For weeks, she and Sarah had released fragments of the truth, each revelation striking like a hammer against the stone walls of Cleveland's power. But now those walls, desperate not to crumble, pushed back with fury. It began in the newspapers, planted stories claiming Angela had falsified evidence, that she had carried on inappropriate relationships with witnesses, that she herself was under investigation. Talk radio hosts mocked her as unstable, a woman hungry for attention. Anonymous leaflets appeared on street corners with her face printed beneath the word liar. At the precinct, the atmosphere grew poisonous. Colleagues who had once kept silent now spoke openly against her. "She's tearing us apart," one officer muttered loud enough for her to hear. Another sneered that she had betrayed the brotherhood of the badge. Angela kept her head high, but every step through those halls was heavier than the last. Only Mark walked at her side, and even he bore the sting of their contempt. "You don't have to do this," she told him one afternoon, but Mark shook his head fiercely. "If I leave now, then everything you've taught me about what this badge means is a lie." His loyalty cut through the gloom like a candle in a dark room. The threats grew bolder. Her car was nearly run off the road again, and one night she returned home to find her front door ajar. Inside, nothing had been stolen, but her files were scattered, photographs ripped, a single bullet left on her kitchen table. Angela stood in the silence of her violated home, her hands trembling for only a moment before she forced them still. She picked up the bullet, placed it in a drawer, and whispered to herself, "You won't scare me out of this." Sarah, too, became a target. One evening, she called Angela in tears, saying her editor had suspended her after pressure from city officials. "They're trying to shut me down," she said bitterly. Angela's voice was calm, steady, the anchor Sarah needed. "They're afraid of what you've uncovered. If they silence you in print, we'll find another way. Truth doesn't need a single outlet, it finds its way through cracks." The next morning, Sarah published her latest article on an independent platform online. Within hours, it spread faster than anything before, shared by citizens hungry for the truth. The establishment's attempt to muzzle her had only amplified her voice. But Angela knew they wouldn't stop at smears and intimidation. The deeper she dug, the closer she came to exposing the Riverfront scandal, the missing millions tied to the city's most celebrated leaders. That revelation, if made public, would shake Cleveland to its core, which was why her enemies were determined to stop her before it saw daylight. One cold evening, Mark rushed into her office, pale and breathless. "Detective, you need to see this." He handed her a document. An internal memo circulated quietly through the department. It recommended Angela's suspension, citing reckless behavior and compromised judgment. The signatures of 3 senior officials stared up at her like a verdict already written. Angela read it in silence, then folded the paper carefully. "They want me out before I can take the next step," she said. Mark's jaw tightened. "Then we don't give them the chance." That night, Angela met Sarah at the small diner where their alliance had first begun. Rain streaked down the windows as the 2 women leaned across the booth, voices hushed but resolute. "If they suspend me, they'll bury everything," Angela said. "The files, the testimonies, it'll all disappear." Sarah's eyes shone with urgency. "Then we release it now, not a piece at a time, all of it. Let the city see everything before they can silence you." Angela hesitated. She knew the danger of unleashing it all at once. The city would erupt. Allies could be caught in the crossfire. But as she looked into Sarah's unwavering eyes, she realized the truth had already grown too large to contain. Keeping it in shadows any longer would only serve those who feared it. Mark joined them at the booth, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "You've taught me something these past weeks," he said quietly. "Justice isn't safe. It isn't comfortable. But it's worth everything. If this is the fight, then let's fight it to the end." "Oh." Angela felt a swell of pride, rare and fragile, as she looked at the young officer and the determined journalist who had chosen to stand with her. She realized that no smear, no threat, no bullet on her table could erase what they had already built together, a truth too strong to be silenced. That night, Angela returned home and spread the files across her table once more. The Riverfront contracts, the shell companies, the names of men who had built their fortunes on lies. She thought of Mrs. Alvarez clutching her hand, of citizens who had filled the church basement with trembling hope, of Mark's quiet loyalty and Sarah's defiance. She knew the cost could be her career, her safety, even her life. But she also knew the cost of silence would be far greater. As the rain pounded against her windows, Angela whispered the words that had become her shield, her compass, her vow. Justice has no place for compromise. And with that, she began to prepare for the release that would tear the veil from Cleveland's most powerful men, knowing that once the truth was unleashed, there would be no turning back. The decision weighed on Angela Carter like a stone pressing against her chest. But once it was made, there was no turning back. For weeks, she had held the truth in fragments, careful not to reveal too much at once. But her enemies had grown bolder, closing in with every weapon they had: smear campaigns, threats, even the looming order of suspension. If she waited any longer, the files would vanish, the evidence buried, and her voice silenced. It had to happen now. The truth had to be released in its entirety, raw and undeniable. She spent the night with Mark and Sarah at her kitchen table. The files spread wide in chaotic piles, the air thick with the smell of coffee and the hum of exhaustion. Mark worked the old printer until it groaned, producing copies of every ledger, every testimony, every contract. Sarah drafted the statement that would accompany the release, her words sharp and steady. "The people of Cleveland deserve to know how deeply corruption has stolen from them, from their safety, from their homes, from their future." Angela read it once, nodded, and signed her name at the bottom. No flourish, no hesitation, just her name, plain and clear, claiming the responsibility she had chosen. By dawn, the files were in motion. Sarah uploaded them to multiple servers, sending them to trusted journalists across the country, not just within Cleveland. Mark hand-delivered packets to community leaders, church pastors, and neighborhood groups, making sure the information could not be contained even if someone tried to erase it. Angela herself walked into Internal Affairs with a sealed folder and placed it on Lieutenant Harris's desk. "This is everything," she told him. "If you bury it, you'll answer not only to me but to the city." Harris, who had always kept his expression guarded, looked up at her with something like reluctant respect. "You've just set fire to the house we all live in," he muttered. Angela met his gaze without flinching. "Then maybe it's time we rebuilt it." The explosion was immediate. By noon, news outlets across the country carried the story. Televised anchors read out the names of judges, councilmen, and businessmen tied to millions of dollars funneled through fraudulent contracts. Radio stations buzzed with callers outraged at the betrayal. Online forums lit up with fury and disbelief. Citizens marched on City Hall, their chants echoing through the streets. "No more lies, no more thieves." The city Angela had known, weary and resigned, had awakened in a roar. But with the roar came chaos. City officials scrambled to deny the claims, calling the documents fabrications. Lawyers filed injunctions to block their publication, though the information had already spread too far to contain. The mayor appeared on television, pale and sweating, promising a thorough review while avoiding every direct question. The streets outside the courthouse swelled with protesters, some carrying signs with Angela's name scrawled in bold letters, others demanding resignations and arrests. At the precinct, the reaction was explosive. Some officers cursed Angela openly, shouting that she had destroyed the department's reputation. Others stood silently, their faces conflicted, unwilling to admit aloud that she had done what many had only dreamed of. Mark walked beside her through the hallways, his young jaw set, his eyes flashing with defiance. "They can hate us all they want," he whispered, "but they can't unsee the truth." That evening, Angela returned home to find her street filled with cars. Neighbors stood on their porches, some applauding, some glaring, all of them aware that she had set the city ablaze. Mrs. Alvarez, the grieving mother whose son's case had been buried, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. She pressed Angela's hand in both of hers and whispered, "For the first time, I believe they might listen." The moment was fleeting, because danger still stalked close. Angela knew the network she had exposed would not simply collapse without resistance. That night, as she sat in her darkened living room, she noticed a black sedan parked across the street, its engine idling. It remained there for an hour, then another, before finally rolling away. She sat unmoving, steady, her heart heavy but unyielding. They were watching, waiting, but so was she. The following morning, federal investigators arrived in Cleveland. The Department of Justice announced a formal inquiry into the corruption scandal. The names Angela had exposed were now the subject of national scrutiny. Arrest warrants were issued for 3 lower-level officials almost immediately, and the sight of them led away in handcuffs sent another wave of shock through the city. For the first time, people began to believe that change might be possible. Angela stood in the middle of it all, weary but unbroken. Reporters crowded her at every step, their microphones thrust forward, their questions relentless. She gave no speeches, only short statements. "This isn't about me, it's about justice. It's about truth." And always, she repeated the words that had become both her shield and her battle cry: "Justice has no place for compromise." As protests filled the streets and investigations deepened, Angela felt the tide finally shifting. The city was in turmoil, but beneath the chaos, she sensed something she had not felt in years: hope. Cleveland was no longer willing to look away. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back in the shadows. Still, she knew this was only the beginning. The men she had named were powerful, with friends and allies far beyond Cleveland's borders. They would not fall quietly. But Angela Carter was ready. She had chosen her path, and there was no turning back now. The fire Angela Carter had set in Cleveland burned brighter by the day, a fierce orange edge licking at the old scaffolding of power. And with every inch of ground she gained, the shadows pressed closer, colder, more deliberate, as if the city itself were holding its breath, to see which force would finally swallow the other. She understood now that for all the noise in the streets and the fresh federal eyes trained on City Hall, the men she had named were not built to accept loss. They were built to endure and to strike, to vanish into back rooms and emerge with sharper knives. And so the smear campaigns that had tried to call her unhinged, the envelopes of cash that had insulted her with their quiet contempt, the midnight phone calls that had breathed nothing but the certainty of danger, all of that had been merely the rehearsal for a darker act. It began on a bitter Thursday, when the sky was the color of old slate and her breath fogged the windshield, when her hands, steady from years of stakeouts and courtroom swearing, felt the slightest tremor as headlights rose in the rearview mirror and kept rising, too close, far too close, until a truck filled the glass like a rushing wall. She had just enough time to think, "Not today," before the first hit folded metal, a sound like teeth scraping iron, and the second hit leaped at her, shoving her toward the overpass guardrail, a teasing nudge at the lip of emptiness, the black ribbon of freeway yawning below, and training took over. A hard brake, a twist, a prayer said without words, the wheels shuddering against her palms as the truck roared past and vanished, the taillights swallowed by night, leaving her on the shoulder with the stink of burnt rubber and the ticking of a wounded engine. She sat motionless, gripping the wheel until feeling returned to her fingers, and then she let out a breath that had been living somewhere near her spine. She knew what had happened. Knew it with the clarity that makes a person older in a single minute, because this was not a warning left on a stoop or a laughable rumor in a morning paper. This was the physics of intent. Steel and speed pointed at her life, and for a brief second, she allowed the truth to wash over her like cold water. They had tried to kill her. Mark Henderson arrived in a rush, his face pale, with the helpless rage of a man young enough to believe the world might still respect rules, and he ran his hands along the bruised bumper, as if cataloging a crime scene with touch alone. And he said in a voice that shook that they would not stop, that they would keep coming until there was nothing left of her but a framed photo at a funeral. And Angela looked at him, steady as a plumb line despite the adrenaline still ghosting her veins, and told him that desperation was the last refuge of losing men, that the only way through was forward, that if they wanted her gone, then the answer was to bring the full weight of the truth crashing down before they found a cleaner method. Sarah Whitman turned the wreck into testimony the next morning, laying out photos in the timeline with a reporter's simple, terrible logic, and beneath her words ran the deeper chord of indictment. If power must resort to attempted murder, then what does that say about the rot we have tolerated? The response was a flare of outrage that leaped beyond Cleveland, voices from other places shouting that this could be any city, that corruption grows in silence and eats whatever it can reach, and Angela felt for the first time that the fight had widened into something larger than herself, a current she had stepped into that now carried her even as it threatened to drown her. Then the counterstroke landed, not with a fist, but with the thud of a sealed envelope and the oily smile of a process that knows how to weaponize procedure. A grand jury, convened in secrecy and fed the carefully salted grievances of men with old favors to collect, returned an indictment for misconduct and abuse of authority, turning the moment of her courage into a charge and the badge on her chest into a target. Two officers with eyes that would not meet hers stood at her office door and said the words as if reciting a prayer they did not believe, and she lifted her chin, surrendered her weapon and her shield, and told Mark to stand down because sometimes the true power of a lie is best shown beneath the cruelties of bright lights and a booking camera. They marched her past colleagues who muttered traitor and shook their heads as if betrayal were not the closing of eyes but the opening of them, and the cuffs felt heavier than the ones she had fastened around Doyle's wrists because they did not merely ring with outrage, they hummed with the grief of a system that refuses to see itself. Cameras flashed like summer lightning, and a woman on a courthouse step shouted that Angela had it coming, and then a man with the tremor of a factory shift in his voice shouted back that his brother had been erased by a judge on the take, and the crowd split along that invisible old line between fear and hope. Noise gathering on both sides as if to prove that truth always arrives with an argument in its hands. Sarah wrote as if her keyboard were an oath, making plain that this was not justice but retaliation, that the timing of the indictment told its own story, and within a handful of days federal voices sharpened. The Department of Justice asked pointed questions about due process, and a judge with a spine unbent by favors ordered Angela released pending review, and when she stepped out into air and sound again, there were chants and tears and a paper sign in a child's hands that read in awkward block letters that justice did not make deals. She did not grandstand. She said only that the city deserved better than lies dressed as law, that this was bigger than any single uniform or office. And then she went home by a back way to a living room that smelled faintly of old coffee and printer ink and the stubborn persistence of late nights. They gathered there, the three of them, the detective, the reporter, the young officer who had allowed his ideals to be annealed in the heat of danger, and Angela spread the Riverfront contracts on the table like a map to buried sin, tracing with her finger the path of money that flowed from public trust to private pockets, naming quietly the councilmen and the developers and the judges whose signatures bloomed like bruises across the page, and she said that the truck on the highway had told them everything they needed to know about how close they were, and Mark asked what came next, and Sarah said the words like a vow, that they finish it. In the days that followed, the city turned itself inside out. Protesters thrummed outside City Hall and the courthouse. Pastors opened their doors to teach-ins and prayer circles, where grandmothers spoke with clear voices about decades of neglect hidden behind ribbon cuttings. And the precinct where Angela had once been met with silence, now roiled with arguments that spilled from locker rooms into squad cars, some officers calling her a disgrace, while others, mostly younger and mostly tired of swallowing what they knew, said that perhaps the disgrace was the thing they had all agreed to ignore. Internal affairs, forced by sunlight and public memory sharper than any knife, reopened files that had slept beneath dust. Traffic camera footage from the night of the truck surfaced curiously late and curiously incomplete, but a single frame, grainy and imperfect, caught the slant of a license plate that did not belong to any ordinary citizen, and Harris, whose gaze had always held a ledger of what could be said aloud, called Angela into his office and told her, in a voice that sounded like stone, that he could not promise protection, but he could promise movement. And perhaps that was the nearest thing to courage a man in his position could offer. The mayor went on television to plead for calm, his hands making small, helpless circles, and a councilman accused in Sarah's latest piece shouted about witch hunts before slipping into a waiting car with tinted windows. An old judge announced a sudden retirement with a note about family, and a developer released an op-ed about his love for the city that read like a man trying to hold water in his hands. And everywhere Angela went, she saw the split look of people who had built their lives in the long shadow of practical compromise, now forced to squint into hard noon. At night, the black sedan returned to idle across from her porch, an outline of threat framed by the glow of a cigarette ember, and she sat inside with the lights off and the evidence spread before her, and thought of the mothers who had begged for simple fairness, of the children who inherit whatever adults choose to tolerate, of her own father teaching her, years ago in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and soap, that a promise is not the words you say but the weight you carry when no one is watching. She pressed her palm flat on the contracts and felt how thin paper is and how heavy it can become when enough people read it. The indictment had failed to pin her down, but it had taught her the last lesson she needed, that the fortress would not fall to careful chiseling alone, that sometimes you must set the beams on fire and usher everyone into the street to watch what burns and what is worth rebuilding. So she began to sketch the contours of the endgame, a release, not in fragments, but in a single bell note that would ring through every corridor, a simultaneous delivery to the federal team, to national desks, to pastors and principals and neighborhood captains, a map and a legend and an index so plain that even those who had spent years pretending not to see would be forced to admit what stood before them. Mark, who had learned to sleep on adrenaline and hope in equal measures, promised to courier boxes if servers failed. Sarah, suspended from her paper but freer than ever, secured mirror sites and lined up anchors who would say the names out loud. Harris, without saying the word ally, muttered something about timing and left a stack of subpoenas where they could be found. Cleveland, that stubborn city of lake wind and steel stomachs, seemed to pause and lean toward its own future. And Angela, tired to the marrow, found herself praying without voice that when the last card fell, there would still be enough left unbroken to build with. She stood, closed her eyes for the length of a heartbeat, opened them on Mark and Sarah, and said the sentence that had carried her through every corridor of fear, the one truth she trusted like breath: justice has no place for compromise, and tomorrow we prove it. Angela Carter had always known that Doyle was not the heart of the disease, but only its visible symptom. And now, with the city on fire and federal investigators circling like hawks, she felt the weight of the final truth pressing against her chest. The knowledge that there was one figure above them all, one man whose name still carried reverence at luncheons and charity galas, whose handshakes adorned campaign posters, whose speeches about civic pride made the evening news, and whose signature appeared, faint but undeniable, at the bottom of the Riverfront contracts that had bled millions from Cleveland's coffers. His name had hovered at the edge of her investigation for weeks, whispered by the fearful, scribbled in anonymous notes, muttered by informants too terrified to look her in the eye. And each time she saw it, she forced herself to set it aside until the evidence was complete, because to accuse without proof was to invite destruction. But now the proof lay before her in neat piles of paper and in the voices of people who had finally dared to speak. And the name was no longer a rumor, but a weight. Senator Charles Whitmore, the man Cleveland had long called its favorite son. She remembered shaking his hand once at a fundraiser years ago, his smile wide, his presence commanding, the sort of man people called untouchable, not only because of his office, but because of the way he carried himself, as if the city were stitched into his suit jacket. To name him would not only ignite a scandal, but would threaten to tear the civic fabric of Cleveland apart. Mark Henderson sat across the table, eyes wide, reading the documents with disbelief. "A senator?" he whispered, the word fragile as though saying it aloud might bring the ceiling down. Sarah Whitman, steadying herself with a pen clenched between her fingers, said quietly, "It was always bigger than Doyle. This is the rot at the root." Angela closed her eyes for a moment. Hearing the echo of Doyle's laughter the day she cuffed him, the smug assurance that his friends in City Hall and beyond would protect him, and now she understood that he had not been bluffing. He had been leaning on the shadow of Whitmore, a man so powerful that his name alone had been shield enough for years. But Angela also knew that every fortress has a gate, and this gate was money, cold and undeniable, numbers that lined up too perfectly to be explained away. She and Sarah and Mark worked through the night preparing the final release, a dossier thicker than any before, tying Whitmore to the shell companies, to the developers, to Doyle himself. Each page was a nail, each figure a hammer, and as dawn broke over Lake Erie, the three of them sat in exhausted silence, staring at the heap of evidence that would either vindicate them or destroy them. Sarah finally broke the quiet, saying, "Once this is out, there's no going back. They won't just smear us. They'll come with everything they have." Angela looked at her, then at Mark, whose youth had been burned into something older these past weeks, and she answered simply, "Then let them come. The truth is heavier than their lies." That morning, packets were sent to national newspapers, to television anchors, to federal offices in Washington. Angela herself walked to a community center on the west side where citizens had been gathering nightly, and she laid the evidence out on a folding table beneath the dim light of a church hall. Mothers, factory workers, retirees leaned in to see the numbers, the signatures, the checks that had stolen from their city while schools decayed and streets crumbled, and a murmur rose that grew into a roar, outrage mixing with vindication, because now the corruption was not an abstraction, but a face they all knew, a man whose posters still hung on lampposts promising progress. By evening, the story had exploded. Senator Whitmore implicated in Cleveland corruption scandal. The senator appeared on television, his voice calm, dismissive, insisting the documents were forgeries, political theater orchestrated by a rogue detective. But his eyes, once confident, flickered too quickly, and Angela knew the mask had cracked. Federal agents arrived within days to seize records from his offices, subpoenas flying faster than his lawyers could file motions. And Cleveland boiled with tension, streets filled with both protesters demanding his resignation and loyalists clinging desperately to his image. Angela watched it unfold with a strange mixture of exhaustion and grim satisfaction, knowing the city was standing on the edge of something it had not seen in generations: accountability. Yet she also knew this was the most dangerous moment of all. Power does not die quietly, and men like Whitmore, accustomed to bending reality with money and influence, would not accept defeat without a final blow. That night, as Angela drove home, she saw the same black sedan that had haunted her street waiting at the corner, its engine idling, its presence a reminder that though she had pulled back the curtain, the men behind it were not finished. She parked, walked to her porch without rushing, and felt the eyes from inside the car following her every step. Inside, she set the last file down on her table and whispered to herself the words that had carried her through every sleepless night. Justice has no place for compromise, and tomorrow the city will see what that means. Cleveland woke to sirens plated with church bells, and Angela Carter knew the city was holding its breath. Senator Charles Whitmore's face filled every screen, his lawyers firing motions like flares, allies crying politics. Yet the paperwork still ran clean and cold from his office, through shell companies to Doyle's accounts. So she poured coffee, spread the Riverfront files across her kitchen table, and reminded herself that a promise is the weight you carry when nobody's watching, even on the day everybody is. By mid-morning, a special hearing had packed the council chamber with federal agents, council members, and a wall of citizens whose murmurs climbed the marble and came back down as a hush. Angela took her seat with Sarah Whitman and Mark Henderson at her sides. Across the aisle, Whitmore entered ringed by attorneys with doorless faces. Before testimony, his lead counsel stood and in a voice polished by habit unveiled new evidence. Glossy photos of ledgers with red circles around discrepancies. A sworn statement from an IT expert claiming Angela had altered timestamps, and the accusation that Doyle's arrest was a made-for-TV stunt. Doubt drifted through the room like a draft under a door. Angela felt Mark tense. She touched his sleeve and waited. When recognized, she rose without hurry and said the senator had brought marks on paper, while the city held the paper itself. Then she set a battered banker's box on the table, drew out a carbon copy receipt book, whose impressions were so deep you could feel the handwriting with your fingertips, original purchase logs for materials never delivered, invoices paid with public money to contractors who never showed on site, each page initialed by a project manager who had given a sealed statement to federal agents the night before. If timestamps invite debate, carbon does not. Sarah slid a second box forward, photocopied cashier's checks, bundled with deposit slips, stamped by 2 Cleveland branches on consecutive days, and a memo on an intermediary foundation's letterhead, signed by Whitmore's longtime fixer, authorizing accelerated municipal reimbursement to a shell company registered to a mailbox on Lorraine Avenue. Objections flew about chain of custody and due process. Lieutenant Harris testified that Internal Affairs retrieved the documents in an unannounced archive sweep, logged and sealed them, while a parallel bank subpoena produced identical deposit records 2 paths, same footprints. Counsel pivoted to character, painting Angela as a vengeful outlier. The chairman, sensing the tide, allowed Mark to speak as a citizen. In the plain cadence of a young cop, he said the only spectacle he'd seen was a captain bragging about managing outcomes, that whispers trailed certain benches, that he had watched colleagues avert their eyes when misses. Alvarez begged for her son's case to be reopened. A department is not made noble by silence, he said, but by correcting itself when it forgets its oath. Cameras held their breath. Desperation arrived during recess. A man in a maintenance jacket lunged for the evidence with a screwdriver, was tackled, and from his pocket fell an access card for a private security firm funded by a PAC with Whitmore's name on the doorbell. After lunch, the air felt heavier, as if the room itself had learned something about gravity. Angela asked that the next disclosures be made outside where the city could see its own story. Harris surprised himself by agreeing. On the cold stone steps beneath a low sky, Angela faced microphones and said these were not theories but the bones of theft. Trust is a bridge, and when you find rot, you do not keep walking out of politeness, you stop and fix it and warn your neighbors. Whitmore shouldered forward with a friendly camera crew and called her a liar with elegant phrasing, adding that the evidence lacked living witnesses. Angela nodded to Sarah, who pressed play on a small recorder. Doyle's voice, flat and beaten, naming Whitmore as the man who blessed the funneling with those tidy words accelerated reimbursement. The senator barked that the tape was doctored. Angela said the original sat with federal agents and a signed transcript would be filed by sundown. 2 agents stepped to the rail and announced a warrant for the senator's local offices. The crowd exhaled, not triumph and not rage, but the release of years of suspicion. Then, 3 mid-level administrators from the Development Authority stepped forward, hands shaking, and said they would cooperate. For years, they had been told, this is how the city works, and they were done being told. Rumors skittered a last-minute injunction, a bank server hiccup, a courthouse alarm that spilled everyone into the damp, but each maneuver arrived a beat too late and looked exactly like what it was. As dusk gathered, Whitmore moved toward a black-windowed car and found his path quietly blocked by a line of uniformed officers, led by a gray-haired sergeant who did not raise his voice or his hand. They simply did not move, and the senator, long buoyed by deference, learned how air feels when it does not part for you. Angela felt no glee, only the sober ache that follows truth, because victory and loss often share a border. She turned to Mark and Sarah and said the hardest work would be rebuilding without bitterness, teaching a city how to trust again, holding firm without going hard. Then, because promises matter, she faced the crowd and repeated the sentence that had carried her through every corridor of fear, the one she hoped would outlast headlines and hearings alike. Justice has no place for compromise. By the time the lake winds softened and the evening lights came on along Euclid, Cleveland had begun to sound different, less like a city bracing for a blow and more like a place slowly relearning its own voice. In the days after the steps and the tape and the quiet line of officers that did not move, federal agents emptied boxes from offices that had seemed untouchable, and the headlines, for once, did not turn away. Captain Richard Doyle agreed to cooperate in a plea that named the hidden hands he had once boasted about, and Senator Charles Whitmore found himself answering questions, not from adoring cameras, but from people who speak in oaths. It did not happen all at once. Truth never does, but subpoenas became indictments, committees became reforms with dates and duties, and the long, low disappointment that had lived in the city's bones began to ease. In a small courtroom with scuffed benches, Mrs. Alvarez sat 2 rows back as a judge reopened her son's case. When the bailiff called the matter, Angela Carter stood at the aisle and did not speak. There are moments when silence is the only honest language, and Mrs. Alvarez reached for her hand anyway, as if to borrow steadiness for a breath. The department changed, not by miracle but by measure. new training that spoke plainly about conflict and pressure, a review board stocked with citizens whose hands still bore the marks of real work, a policy that turned sunlight from a slogan into a habit. Some officers retired quietly, a few issued statements. Most simply did the difficult work of showing up and doing better. Mark Henderson, thinner in the face and older in the eyes, pinned a modest commendation to his dress, blues, and asked to transfer into internal affairs. Not as a punishment, but as a promise, because he had learned that guarding the gate is not the job of cynics, but of caretakers. Sarah Whitman returned to print, suspended no longer, and wrote not only about the villains who fell, but about the people who held the line. The clerk who pointed to a mislabeled box, the gray-haired sergeant who did not move, the neighbors who stood in the cold without shouting. As for Angela, she reclaimed her badge for a while, long enough to walk a few cases to honest endings and to make sure the reforms were more than memos. And then she did something that surprised even the friends who knew her best. She asked for a post at the academy. On the first morning of the spring intake, she stood before a room of recruits in uniforms too new to bend and told them that a badge is not a prize you win, but a weight you carry, that compromise dresses itself in fine words and friendly favors, and that courage is often quiet, like showing up to tell a grieving mother the truth and staying until the coffee goes cold. She did not mention her own story. She did not need to. Word has a way of traveling without permission. In the evenings, she walked home along familiar blocks where porches held the hush of supper voices, and now and then someone would lift a hand, just a small wave, no speech, the sort of thing that says, "We see you and we are trying to." On Sundays, she sometimes found herself in the back pew of a church that smelled of lemon oil and hymnals, listening as a pastor thanked the congregation for choosing decency when anger would have been easier. On a weekday morning, she crossed paths with a school crossing guard who leaned on her stop sign and said the city felt lighter this spring, like a coat left behind. There were still sirens, there will always be sirens, and there were still rooms where the old instincts whispered, but the whispers did not win the day. A year is not enough to heal everything, yet it can be long enough to prove that healing is possible. When the anniversary of the meeting that began it all came around, there was no parade, no official ceremony, only a small gathering near the steps where the crowd had once held its breath. Mrs. Alvarez brought a photograph of her boy and tucked a flower behind the frame. Mark arrived straight from a shift with coffee for anyone who wanted it. Sarah jotted a few lines in a notebook she did not publish, and Angela stood at the edge of it all, a little apart, watching a city do what families and neighborhoods do when they decide to keep going. She thought about the ordinary traditions she had come to love, the way folks in Cleveland still shovel the neighbor's sidewalk, the way cashiers at corner stores remember names, how a lake wind can turn a stranger's scarf into a shared joke, and she understood the lesson her father had tried to give her long ago at a kitchen table that smelled of soap and coffee. That justice is not thunder, it is a steady rain, and if you are patient and stubborn enough, it reaches every root. She did not need to repeat the line that had carried her through, but when a young recruit with a face still open to the world asked her what one sentence she would choose if she could leave only one, she smiled with a quiet that comes from hard winters and said it anyway. Not as a slogan now, but as a simple truth that belongs to anyone who wants it. Justice has no place for compromise. If this story touched something you remember, if it sounded like your town or your family or something you still hope America can be, tell me in the comments what part stayed with you. And if you'd like more long, gentle stories about ordinary courage and hard-earned grace, please like this video and subscribe. We will keep the porch light on for you, and there will always be a chair. My dear friends, if you've stayed with me until the very last moments, surely your heart has gone through a whirlwind of emotions. Surprise, anger, compassion, even a lump in your throat at the choice made by the black female police officer. What do you think about her action? Was it admirable courage or a risky recklessness? If you were in her place, what would you do? Leave your comment below. If you believe that justice must be protected by the truth, press 1. If you feel there are still mysteries left unsolved, press 0. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you too will always stand on the side of justice, even though the path to the truth is never easy.